The county auction house smelled like dust and broken promises. Margaret stood at the back, watching people shuffle through the lots. Furniture with water stains, farm equipment nobody wanted anymore, the detritus of estate sales and tax foreclosures, everything priced to move. She was 67, retired 3 months, and still figuring out what to do with the hours that used to be filled with classrooms and lesson plans. The greenhouse lot came up at 2 o'clock. No one bid. The auctioneer described it as salvage only. The structure was skeletal, glass long gone, the wooden frame choked with vines and rot, completely worthless. Margaret raised her hand out of something that wasn't hope exactly, just a need to break the silence, to prove she was still here, still capable of wanting something. $1, she said. The auctioneer looked directly at her, a long look, the kind that carries weight. Good luck with whatever's underneath, he said, and brought the gavel down. As Margaret was signing the papers, he pulled her aside. His voice was low. There's something down there. My grandfather knew about it, but some things stay buried for a reason. I'd be careful who you tell. He wouldn't say more, just that warning, hanging in the air between them like humidity before a storm. Margaret had spent 42 years teaching history to kids who were mostly interested in their phones. She'd stood in front of classrooms explaining the significance of the Homestead Act and the Erie Canal, watching their eyes glaze over. History was something that happened to other people in other times. That was the message, whether she meant to send it or not. Her pension was thin, her house was paid for, but the roof needed replacing, and the bathroom fixtures belonged to 1987. She didn't have money for either. What she had was time, suddenly, radically, too much time. The superintendent had offered her a full retirement package, and she'd taken it because she was tired of the fluorescent lights and the administrative emails about learning outcomes. Now she was buying a greenhouse for $1 at a county auction. The property was 5 acres of overgrown pasture, set back from the county road. She drove out that afternoon, the deed on the passenger seat. The greenhouse came into view slowly. A skeletal frame of rotted wood, vines spiraling around every beam like they were trying to strangle something already dead. No glass, no roof in places, just the skeleton of a structure that hadn't been loved in decades. She parked and walked the perimeter. The air was heavy with rust and wet earth. Something about the foundation caught her attention. The brickwork was too deliberate, too intentional for a greenhouse support. Those bricks were old, hand-cut. The mortar was crumbling, but the pattern was deliberate, laid by someone who knew what they were doing. In the corner, mostly hidden by vines, was a metal grate, rusted shut. But there was a draft coming through it, cold air moving upward. She placed her palm over the opening and felt it. Cold breath from something below. Her hands were shaking as she drove home. That night, she pulled out her county maps, the ones she'd kept from her teaching days. The property sat on a corridor, the historic route through rural Ohio. The Underground Railroad had moved through this area. She read about the network of safe houses, the tunnels some conductors had built with their own hands, passages hidden beneath farms and barns, but nothing mentioned this property. No records, no acknowledgement, which meant either the documentation had been lost or it had been deliberately destroyed. Margaret sat in her kitchen at midnight, understanding for the first time in 3 months that retirement wasn't about rest. It was about being given a second chance at questions she'd never had time to ask. She would start digging, both literally and historically. The next morning, Margaret returned with tools, a crowbar, work gloves, a flashlight that cost more than the greenhouse. She'd bought the flashlight at a hardware store an hour away, where no one knew her. That seemed important for reasons she couldn't articulate. The grate was heavier than it looked. Decades of rust had fused it to the brick. She worked the crowbar underneath, felt the metal resist, heard it groan. Then it screamed, a sound like something waking up angry. The grate tore free, and Margaret stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her ribs. Below her, a shaft descending into darkness. The bricks lining the walls were hand-cut, uneven, the kind of work that takes weeks of labor. The mortar between them was crumbling to powder, but it still held. She ran her fingers across it, feeling the texture, the evidence of someone's hands, a century and a half ago, setting each brick with intention. This wasn't the work of a contractor. This was the work of someone with a reason to build something that would last. She estimated the tunnel was at least 150 years old, maybe older. Her flashlight caught something bolted into the brick wall, an iron ring, black with age, for climbing. Someone had secured it there so people could descend safely into the dark. Margaret was a teacher. Documentation was instinct. She took photographs, the grate, the bricks, the iron ring. She noted the dimensions, the orientation, north-south, positioned so you couldn't see it from the main road. She wrote everything in a notebook, her handwriting shaking. Then she gripped the iron ring and lowered herself into the shaft. The air changed as she descended. It got colder, damper. It smelled like stone and time, like the inside of a tomb. Each rung held. She was surprised by that. The metal was old, but it didn't fail her. Someone had built this to carry weight, to carry people. The tunnel opened into a chamber, 12 feet across, maybe 15 feet long. The walls were brick, reinforced, and the ceiling was arched, the kind of engineering that required knowledge, skill. This wasn't panic. This was planning. In the corner, partially collapsed, was a wooden crate. Next to it, a leather satchel, dark with age but intact, preserved by the dry air, sealed from the world above. Margaret's hands were shaking as she opened it. Inside, letters, tied with twine. The ink was faded but legible. The first one was dated 1853. It was addressed to the next soul who finds this. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was deliberate, careful, the script of someone who knew history was watching. It was a confession, a documentation. The man's name was Samuel Hutchins. He wrote about 47 people, 47 souls he had guided through this tunnel. He wrote about the fear, his fear and theirs. He wrote about the moral weight of it, the nights he couldn't sleep. He wrote about the ones who made it and the ones who didn't. And then, near the end, he wrote something that made Margaret's chest tighten. If you're reading this, the world has changed. Tell their stories. They deserve to be remembered. She sat on the damp floor and cried. In the crate, wrapped in cloth that was disintegrating into dust, a child's shoe, a tin cup, a brass button, the kind from a military uniform, a wooden cross carved by hand, a tin of salve with a label in German, medicine probably, for someone sick, someone hurt, personal objects, the things people carried when they had nothing else to carry. Each one was a ghost story waiting to be told. Margaret spent 3 hours in that chamber, photographing every page, handling everything with gloved hands. By the time she climbed back out, the sun was setting. She sealed the grate again, covered it with branches, and drove home in silence. The leather satchel sat on the passenger seat beside her. The County Historical Society was in the courthouse basement, a cramped office that smelled like old paper and dust. Margaret found it the next morning, walking past filing cabinets and microfiche machines that nobody used anymore. Behind the desk sat Dorothy, 83 years old, with white hair pinned up and reading glasses on a chain. She'd worked there for 40 years. Margaret approached casually. Just browsing. Just curious about the area where she'd bought some property. What kind of property? Dorothy asked. Margaret mentioned the 5-acre parcel, the ruined greenhouse, Dorothy went very still. Her hands stilled on the papers in front of her. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. "Why are you asking about that particular land?" Dorothy said. Margaret lied. Said she was just curious. Wanted to know the history. Thought it might be interesting. Dorothy studied her for a long time. Then she stood up, walked to a locked cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a box. The label on it read, "Hutchins Family Papers, Restricted." "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask," Dorothy said. She set the box on the desk between them. Inside were more letters. A daguerreotype, a man in his 50s, stern-faced, the kind of photograph where people didn't smile. A deed to the property, dated 1847. Dorothy pulled out each item like she was unwrapping something sacred. She told Margaret the story. Samuel Hutchins was a white farmer, a Quaker. He believed in the testimony of conscience. So when fugitives started coming through the area, moving north on the Underground Railroad, he helped them. His family disowned him for it. The church rejected him. He lost his original farm. People wouldn't trade with him, wouldn't do business with a man who harbored runaway slaves. So he moved to the remote property, the isolated land, and he built the tunnel system. He kept meticulous records of everyone he helped, not for glory, as a moral obligation, as testimony. In 1863, he died of pneumonia. Dorothy's voice was quiet when she said it. The damp work, the tunnel, the constant cold and wet. It killed him. His wife destroyed most of his papers after his death, trying to protect the family from retaliation. But Dorothy's grandmother was a neighbor. She saved what she could. The town wanted to forget, Dorothy said. Easier that way. No guilt, no reckoning. Margaret asked if there were records of the people he helped. Dorothy pulled out a ledger. Samuel's own accounting. Names, dates, destinations. 47 people over 8 years. Each entry had a note. Safe passage. Recovered from injury. Separated from family. Margaret read through the pages, her hands steady but her throat tight. And then she found the last entry. A woman named Ruth Freeman. 2 children, names listed as Thomas and Eleanor. Passage dated March 1862. Samuel had written beside the entry. Ruth's husband was sold downriver. She carried his watch. I told her he would have wanted her to live. Margaret couldn't read past that. She left with copies of everything, Dorothy's blessing and a warning. Some people in this town won't want this story told. The land was valuable once. Developers have been circling. A story like this could complicate things. That week, Margaret searched. Census records, ship manifests, Toronto registries. She found a Ruth Freeman, age 34, listed in Toronto in 1863, with 2 children named Thomas and Eleanor. Ruth had survived. She had made a life, but no one in this county knew her name. The first call came on a Tuesday. A man's voice, smooth and professional. His name was Derek Paulson. He represented a development firm. He'd heard Margaret had recently purchased 5 acres on the county road. He wanted to make an offer, $180,000. Margaret said, no, the property wasn't for sale. He called back 3 days later, $200, rising. Each conversation the same, polite, persistent, the tone of someone used to hearing yes. He mentioned the property would be perfect for a mixed-use development, retail, maybe some residential, good for the county, good for the tax base. She kept saying no. The third call came on a Saturday morning, $250,000. His voice carried something different now, not aggression exactly, but a kind of certainty. The certainty of a man who believes everything has a price, and he just hadn't found hers yet. Let me know when you change your mind, he said. I'm confident you will." Then he stopped calling. The silence that followed was heavier than the offers. Margaret started asking questions around town, carefully. A banker at the credit union mentioned that developers had been buying up rural properties in the county for months, turning them into luxury homes. "Good for the tax base," he said, echoing Derek's words. "Good for growth." She understood then. The town was hungry for development, for money, for the economic boost that comes with new construction. A story about the Underground Railroad, about historic preservation, about protected sites and restricted development would be an obstacle, a complication, a problem. She called Dorothy. Dorothy listened to everything, the calls, the pressure, the realization of what was at stake. And then she said something that made Margaret understand she wasn't the first person to make this choice. "There's a man named Garrett Walsh," Dorothy said. "He's on the Historical Preservation Board. He's a retired architect. He cares about real history. He'll want to know." Garrett came to Margaret's house that afternoon. He was 55, with grey at his temples and the kind of careful attention to detail that comes from years of designing buildings. She showed him the tunnel, the artifacts, the letters, laid out on her kitchen table like evidence. He sat in silence for a long time. "This changes everything," he said finally. His voice was quiet. "This is a documented underground railroad station. The artifacts alone are priceless, historically priceless. This could be a museum, a research center. This could put your county on the map." He explained the legal implications, historic designation, protected status, potential partnerships with universities, with the National Park Service. But then he leaned back, and his expression shifted. "The developer won't stop," he said, "and the town council won't risk political suicide by opposing growth. You understand that, right?" Within days, the planning director visited. His name was Richard. He was cordial. He brought a folder with maps and projections. But the message underneath the politeness was clear. "We've heard you've made some interesting discoveries," he said. "Before you do anything with that property, I think you should understand the complications." He explains that historic designation would make development nearly impossible. Property taxes would increase on a designated site. The restoration costs would fall on her. Insurance would be complicated. Permits would be slow. Tourists, maybe. Researchers. "It could bankrupt you," he said, not unkindly. "Most people in your situation would take the developer's money and move on." Margaret felt the weight of it pressing down. She was 67. Her pension was thin. $250,000 would change everything. She could fix her roof, replace the bathroom, travel, rest. But Ruth's watch was in that tunnel. Samuel's letters were waiting. She refused. The calls from the developer stopped, but the pressure shifted. A neighbor mentioned that some people thought she was being foolish. The local paper published an opinion piece about the dangers of over-regulation, over-preservation, the way government interference could strangle economic growth. They didn't mention her by name. They didn't have to. One night, someone left a real estate listing on her door, the property marked, "For sale." Her property. She hadn't listed it. She understood then. She was alone in this. The town's institutional weight was against her. The economic logic was against her. The convenient narrative that progress required forgetting was against her. But she had something they didn't have. She had nothing left to lose. Margaret found Dr. Amy Rock at the State University, a historian who'd spent 15 years studying underground railroad sites across Ohio. She sent the photographs first, the tunnel, the bricks, the leather satchel, the letters. She sent copies of Samuel Hutchins' accounting, Ruth Freeman's entry, everything. Amy called back within hours. Her voice was shaking. "This is extraordinary," Amy said. "Do you understand what you have?" Margaret waited. "Documented underground railroad stations are rare," Amy continued. "Most records were destroyed. People hid them, burned them. The fear was too great. But this, a site with artifacts, with identified people, with letters from the conductor himself, this is invaluable." Amy offered to help, to authenticate everything, to publish, to bring academic weight to what Margaret had found. They worked for 3 months. Amy brought in conservators to examine the artifacts. They photographed everything with proper documentation. Margaret provided all the research she'd gathered, the land records, the census data on Ruth Freeman, the newspaper archives that mentioned Samuel Hutchins obliquely, always dismissively. They prepared a formal report, rigorous and careful, the kind of work that couldn't be disputed. Margaret donated the artifacts to the university's archive, but she retained ownership of the property. That was important. The physical place, the tunnel itself, the ground that held it, remained hers. The report was published in a historical journal. Samuel Hutchins and the Rural Abolitionist Underground Railroad Network in Ohio, 1850 to 1863. Within 2 weeks, a regional newspaper picked it up. Hidden Tunnel reveals Ohio's forgotten heroes. Then national outlets. Retired teacher uncovers underground railroad station. Suddenly, Margaret's quiet discovery wasn't quiet anymore. Historians called wanting to visit. Documentary filmmakers called. The National Park Service reached out about potential designation as a historic site. The National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati requested to display copies of the letters. The developers' calls stopped. The property was too complicated now, too public, too laden with historical significance. You couldn't turn that into luxury homes. The liability was too great. The legal complications were too thorny. But something else shifted. Something in the town itself. Dorothy told her that people were talking differently now, not dismissively, with pride, some of them. "We didn't know this was here," people said. "Our ancestors did this brave thing." The town's narrative about itself changed, not from a place of shame, it had never acknowledged enough to feel shame, but from forgetting to remembering. The Historical Society received a grant, expanded. The local museum opened an exhibit about Samuel Hutchins. They displayed copies of the daguerreotype, the deed, selected letters. They told Ruth Freeman's story. The elementary school started teaching the Underground Railroad using primary sources from the tunnel. Actual letters, actual names, actual choices made by actual people. Margaret was invited back to the school where she taught for 42 years. She stood in front of 200 kids in the gymnasium, and she told them about Ruth Freeman carrying her husband's watch, about Samuel Hutchins building that tunnel with his own hands, knowing it would likely kill him. About 47 people who moved through darkness toward light. "The people in this tunnel risked everything," she told them, "so others could be free, and then we forgot them. But history doesn't stay buried, it finds a way back." The kids were quiet, really listening. She understood something in that silence. This was what she was meant to teach, not from a textbook, from the ground itself. A year after the discovery, Margaret received an official letter on state letterhead. They wanted to purchase the property, establish it as a historic site. The offer was $320,000. She could have said yes immediately. $320,000 would mean security. Her roof could be fixed. The bathroom could be renovated. She could travel. She could rest, finally, after 68 years of moving forward. But the letter outlined the state's plan, and there was a condition buried in the details. Public access would be limited. The tunnel would be preserved, but the museum would be modest. Educational programming would be available, but not extensive. It was preservation, technically. But it was preservation that kept the story contained, controlled, safe. Margaret thought about Ruth Freeman in Toronto. She thought about Samuel Hutchins, dead at 53 from pneumonia contracted in that damp tunnel. She thought about the 47 names in that ledger, each one reduced to an entry, a date, a destination. She called the state commissioner directly. "I'll sell," she said, "but there's a condition." The property had to include a memorial, not a plaque, not a marker hidden in a corner, a memorial to all 47 people, names carved in stone, dates, destinations, and underneath each name a single phrase from Samuel's ledger, the words that made each person real, specific, irreplaceable. The state agreed. Over the next year, Margaret worked with a designer and a stonemason. The memorial took the shape of the tunnel itself, a brick wall, curved, descending into the earth. Each name was carved deep enough to catch light and shadow. Each name was visible. The work was slow. The stonemason, a man in his 70s, treated each letter like a prayer. Margaret stood beside him many times, watching him work. She'd bring names and phrases. He'd trace them, understanding what they meant. One afternoon he carved, "Ruth Freeman, she carried his watch." He worked for 6 hours on that single entry. When he finished, he stepped back and didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The dedication happened on a grey November morning. 300 people came. The governor was there. Historians from 3 universities, documentary filmmakers, local people, farmers, teachers, people who'd lived in the county their entire lives and never knew what had been buried beneath their feet. Margaret stood at the tunnel entrance as the sun tried to break through the clouds. The brick wall glowed like it was lit from inside. Each name caught the light. 47 people, visible now. Real. A woman approached her. She was in her 40s, black, with 2 teenagers standing slightly behind her. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm Ruth Freeman's great-great-granddaughter," she said. "I came from Toronto to see my ancestor's name." The woman was crying. Margaret was crying. They stood together at the tunnel entrance, looking at the memorial, and the woman said something that made everything clear. "My family knew she came from Ohio," the woman said, "but we never knew how. We never knew who helped her. Now we do. Now we know Samuel Hutchins' name, and we can say thank you." This moment, Margaret understood. This was what she hadn't anticipated. Not the money, though that mattered. Not the recognition, though that mattered too. But this, the broken connection restored. The story that had been scattered across a century and a continent, suddenly whole again. A descendant standing on the ground where her great-great-grandmother had found shelter, finally knowing the name of the man who'd risked everything to help her survive. Margaret understood then that she'd spent 42 years teaching history as something that happened to other people in other times. But history wasn't finished. It was alive in the ground, in letters, in the descendants who carried it without knowing their own story. And now they knew. Now Ruth Freeman had a name again. 5 years after the discovery, the Samuel Hutchins Underground Railroad Station drew visitors from across the country. School groups came with notebooks. Historians came with questions. Descendants came looking for their own stories. The tunnel, once a secret, had become a place of pilgrimage. Margaret was no longer the retired teacher who bought a greenhouse for $1. She was a historian now. People introduced her that way. Dr. Amy Rock had pushed her toward a degree, online courses, research, publication. Margaret had resisted at first, but then she understood. This wasn't about credentials. It was about authority. Being a historian meant her voice carried weight when she spoke about the forgotten people beneath the ground. But she didn't feel like she'd done anything remarkable. She'd asked questions. She'd listened to what the ground was trying to tell her. She'd refused to look away. The town had transformed too. The developer had moved on to easier land. The Historical Society expanded into 2 buildings. The school curriculum now included primary source analysis using the tunnel documents. Kids learned history not as dates and names in a textbook, but as detective work, finding truth in fragments, in letters, in the objects people left behind. Margaret was 72 now. She turned down book deals and documentary offers. What she wanted was time at the site, training volunteers, answering visitors' questions, sometimes just sitting in the tunnel, listening to the silence the way Samuel Hutchins must have listened, understanding what it meant. One afternoon, a woman came through with an elementary school class. The teacher was young, maybe 30, in her first year. As she led the kids through the tunnel, Margaret heard her voice carrying the kind of passion Margaret remembered from her own beginning. Before the weight of endless compliance and quiet classrooms wore away her instincts for what mattered, the teacher was telling the kids, "This is what real history feels like. Look at the wear on this button. Someone held it for years. These aren't names in a textbook. This is proof that real people stood in this darkness." Margaret introduced herself after the tour. The teacher's eyes widened. "You're Margaret. You're the one who found it." Margaret shook her head. "I found a tunnel," she said. "The town found its conscience. That's different." But as she watched the kids file back through the station, asking questions, taking notes, seeing themselves in history, she understood what Samuel Hutchins had understood, that history isn't about treasure or recognition or the financial security that comes with selling something valuable. It's about the moment when someone realizes, "I could have looked away, but I didn't. I could have stayed silent, but I spoke. I could have let it stay buried, but I dug. And because I did, someone else's story gets to live." Margaret thought about Ruth Freeman in Toronto, building a life with her children. She thought about Samuel Hutchins, dying of pneumonia at 53, knowing his tunnel had carried 47 people toward freedom. She thought about the brick memorial wall, each name glowing in afternoon light, and she thought about all the stories still buried, all the tunnels still hidden, all the evidence of human courage waiting in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to ask what lies beneath the surface. Margaret stands at the tunnel entrance as the sun sets, watching the last visitors leave. The brick memorial wall glows golden in the fading light. She thinks about the greenhouse she bought for $1, worthless on the surface, infinite underneath. But Margaret knows the real discovery wasn't in the ground. It was this, that one person willing to ask questions can restore what an entire community tried to bury. Subscribe to uncover more forgotten histories.